Hey everyone, let me tell you how I managed to get myself into one of my biggest problems. It all started with a client who told me she'd been looking at these incredible sofa designs generated by artificial intelligence and asked if I could build something like that for her. At first I said, no way, that's impossible. But since I'm both stubborn and, well, not exactly the sharpest tool in the shed, I couldn't get the idea out of my head. One thing led to another, and now here I am, with over 500 kilos of mahogany and a promise to build something that at first seemed absolutely impossible. Let's check if I really got what I ordered. Wood like this, kiln-dried and with barely any cracks or defects, hasn't been particularly cheap. I got these 3 beautiful mahogany slabs all from the same tree, so the color and the grain will stay consistent. Each one is almost 12 centimeters thick, and I can already tell working with them on my own won't be easy. This would be the perfect moment for one of those classic YouTube cliffhangers. Something like, stick around until the end to see if I can pull it off. But I'm not going to do that. I'm actually too proud of how it turned out, so I'll just tell you right now. The result is amazing. I couldn't be happier with it. So instead, I just want you to see the process it took to get there. The first thing I'm going to do is take one of the 3 slabs to a sawmill to have it cut in half. I'll need pieces that are about half as thick as they are now, and this is the fastest and easiest way to get them. I've always been fascinated by these machines, and one of my goals is to have one someday. But that would take a lot of things: money, a place to put it, and actually learning how to use it. And honestly, even though I'm acting like I know what I'm doing, this is the first time I've ever seen one of these running in person. It's incredible how much internal tension a slab like this can hold. As soon as it was cut, both pieces immediately warped, almost like a spring. Toward the end, the machine nearly stalled because the sides of the slab were pressing against the saw blade like a clamp. It's one of those things you don't really think about until you actually use a machine like this. I guess it's because the wood is completely dry. Fresh wood just doesn't have this kind of tension yet.
Nice. All right, back in the shop. Time to start cutting all this wood. I'll start with these thinner boards first. Honestly, I'm putting off working on the thick ones as long as I can. I don't even know where to start with those.
This is without a doubt the project I've spent the most time designing and planning out before even getting started. I really wanted to avoid jumping in blindly, hitting a dead end, or realizing I'd have to undo a bunch of work. That's not usually how I operate. I'm more of a start building and solve problems as they pop up kind of guy. But something told me that if I approached it that way this time, there'd be no way I'd actually pull this off. So, yeah. This time, I'm trying to act like a responsible woodworker. When I first started thinking about this project, the main thing I needed was an idea that met 2 conditions. First, it had to match what the client had in mind, something she'd actually like. And second, it had to be realistic. Or better said, something I could actually build. After sketching a bunch of ideas and scrapping most of them, I finally got close to a design I liked. And more importantly, one the client liked too. One of the conditions was that it had to be a chaise lounge, because a regular sofa made out of 500 kilos of solid wood just wouldn't have been challenging enough. Whenever I make a mistake, I try to show it in the video, especially if it's something that could help avoid an accident. Here you can see how the saw gets stuck right at the end of the cut. That happened because I didn't realize I was cutting the slab from the wrong side. Let me explain what I mean by the wrong side. Almost every board, even if it's just a little, has some bow to it. So whenever you're cutting a long, wide, and heavy board along the grain, you've got to make sure the concave side is facing up. If it's facing down, the cut ends up hanging in the air. And when the 2 halves drop, they clamp the blade and stop the saw from moving forward. On top of being rough on the track saw and making it impossible to get a clean cut, this can also be dangerous. It can cause one of those famous kickbacks and send the saw flying backward. It's happened to me a couple of times, and trust me, it's not fun at all. I also recommend making long, deep cuts like this in 2 passes. Otherwise, the blade can heat up too much and burn the wood. This slab is too thick for my track saw, so I'm cutting the last bit by hand. I've got an old shoulder injury, and this isn't doing me any favors, so I'm going to see if I can finish it with the Sawzall. Nope, that's not going to work. It's tearing up the edges way too much, and fixing that later would be a pain. So, yeah, no luck. Looks like I'll just have to deal with the sore shoulder for a couple of days. But hey, I'm not going to complain. Luck is pretty relative. I read the other day that in New York, someone gets hit by a car every 45 minutes. I mean, that guy's got to be the unluckiest person alive. poor guy's got to be a wreck by now. All right, this other slab is a few millimeters thicker, so I'm going to flip it over and use the track saw to cut that last bit. It's not ideal, but I need to give my shoulder a break. And as a reward for the few of you who stuck around after that terrible joke, here's a little tip for when you're buying wood, especially if you're looking for a big slab. Try to avoid one with the heart of the tree right in the center. Wood will always crack along that spot. The other slabs were perfect, barely a crack on them. But look at this one. It's inevitable it'll split there as it dries. I picked this one because it was the only option left, and I needed all the wood to come from the same tree. Plus, since I plan to cut it up anyway, I can just remove the cracked section with no problem. To take on a slab like this, my Festool track saw isn't big enough for the job, so I picked up this Makita. It's got a cutting depth of over 100 millimeters, and I think it should handle it. But even though it's one of the biggest ones on the market, it's still not deep enough, so I'll have to cut it from both sides. I could make a full depth cut with the saw and then finish that last bit by hand, but I'm not doing it that way. And this time, it's not because of my shoulder. Making a cut over 2 meters long, more than 100 millimeters deep, with no exit underneath and no dust extraction. That just doesn't feel safe. The blade would heat up like crazy, and honestly, it's not a cut I'd feel comfortable making. And one of the main rules in woodworking is, if you don't feel safe doing something, don't do it that way. Just figure out another way. There's always an alternative. I made a simple guide for the circular saw, and I'm going to cut about halfway through. I'll make all the cuts on this side, flip it once, and then finish all the cuts from the other side. This way I only have to flip the slab once. Remember, it weighs almost 200 kilos. When you're cutting a slab on the floor, it's not easy to move forward. So I came up with this little skateboard thing. Okay, I'm not expecting a Nobel Prize for it, but if it works, it's not that stupid. There's one thing I'm not very good at. Well, actually, there are a lot of things I'm not good at, but let's focus on one. I've always been terrible at tying knots. It took me over 15 minutes of full concentration to tie this simple knot with the help of a video, and I didn't realize the camera had run out of battery. I wanted to show you how I flipped the slab over, but that part didn't get recorded. I've got another slab just like this one to cut, so I'll show you with that one instead. Cutting wood this way, there's no way to get perfectly clean cuts. But that's fine, we'll deal with that later. For now, I'm pretty happy with how things are going. I thought splitting slabs this thick would be harder, but it's going pretty quickly and without any issues. Alright, now I'll show you how to flip a slab this heavy. With an overhead hoist, of course. If you work alone in your shop, it's pretty much essential. They're not very expensive, and if you ever deal with heavy pieces, it's definitely worth having one installed. And here's a little demonstration of how physics can be pretty amazing sometimes. Sometimes I find a new tool I've never used before, and I like it so much that I start using it for everything. Then I wonder how I ever managed without it. This time, though, it's not something from my workshop. It's on my computer. It's the Opera web browser, and I've got to thank them for sponsoring this video. But before I start sounding like some pushy salesman, let me make this clear. It's completely free. So this time, I'm literally not trying to sell you anything. I've been using it for a few weeks, and it's full of great features. My favorite is Aria, a built-in AI tool you can open with a keyboard shortcut to ask anything like, what's the best wood finish for an outdoor table? It can also create images from simple prompts to get ideas for a project, for example. Or I can take a picture and upload it to get more information, like finding out what type of tree it is, the one at the end of my street. Aria can also help with your tabs. For example, I can write a prompt, group all of my YouTube tabs, and there you go. A so-called tab island is created. You can also manually create tab islands by context to stay organized and collapse or expand them as needed. Another feature I love is split screen. Drag a tab down, and you've got 2 pages side by side without constantly switching tabs or multiple browser windows. And if you're watching your favorite woodworker, but you've had enough of them talking nonsense, Opera has a floating music player that works with 7 different music platforms. You can move it anywhere on your screen and keep working without interruption. There's also a separate video pop-out feature, so you can keep a video playing while you do something else. You can even use it outside the browser. If you want to give Opera a try, it's completely free. Just hit the link in the description to download it. Well, let's get back to work. Now that I've got all the pieces cut to roughly the size I need, I've got a lot of wood to run through the jointer. And I say roughly because they're not at their final size yet. I like to leave a bit of extra material to fix any mistakes. Let me explain in a bit more detail the construction I'm going for. The sofa will have two main parts, the backrest and the seat. At first, the slabs I had were big enough to make each of those out of a single piece, but I decided not to do that. One of my main concerns with this project is wood movement over time, so I need a construction method that minimizes that as much as possible. A single board that's 70 centimeters wide is much more likely to warp over time. So the better option here is to cut 3 narrower boards and join them together. A large panel made of narrower boards will handle wood movement and potential warping much better in the long run. Now I'm working on the seat. It's made of 3 long boards for the main section and another 3 shorter ones for the chaise lounge extension. The long boards are too big, or maybe I should say my jointer's too small, so I won't get perfect edges for the glue up this way. I'm going to use another method. If you've got a good track saw, you can get edges just as clean as with a jointer. The first step is making sure the blade is sharp. If you can, use a brand new one. I set the 2 boards I want to join side by side and make sure they won't move. Then I place the track right between them. The idea is to make one single pass with the saw, cutting right along the joint line and trimming both boards at the same time. You want to move slowly, keep a steady pace, and keep your arm firm to get the cut as straight as possible. By cutting both boards at the same time already in position, they'll fit together perfectly, even if the cut has a slight curve, because that curve will match on both boards. That's not the case if you cut them separately. If the cut isn't perfectly straight, you'll see a gap when you join them, and it's almost impossible to make a perfectly straight long cut with a track saw. I've been resisting buying this tool for a long time, telling myself it wasn't necessary, and that there were other ways to get the job done. But the truth is, I was just being cheap and didn't want to spend the money. Well, it's time to admit it. A Domino is going to make this project so much easier. So I finally bought one. This is actually the first time I've ever used this tool, and this is the very first hole I've made with it. So I'm not about to give a tutorial on how to use it. Like I always do when I get a new tool, I did a bit of research and watched a few YouTube videos to see how it's used. From what I understand, when you're joining boards, you only make one of the holes the exact size of the dowel, and the rest slightly wider. That way the dowel has a bit of side-to-side movement, so you won't have problems if any of the holes are slightly out of alignment. The seat is L-shaped. It's made of this long section built from 3 boards, and a shorter section that I also made by joining 3 boards. These are shorter, so there's no problem flattening the edges with the jointer. Let me tell you a bit about the wood. I chose this type of mahogany for a few reasons. First, I think the color and grain are incredible, and for a piece like this, it's going to look amazing. Plus, the grain is pretty straight and uniform, so even with all these boards joined together in different directions, it should have a more harmonious look. A wood with a wilder grain like walnut or olive could make it feel too busy visually and draw too much attention to the joints and cuts. But the main reason I chose it is because it's one of the most stable woods out there and it moves less over time than most. In a project like this with so many joints and long pieces, that's something I really have to think about. I felt this was the best option. Even with all those precautions, some cracks or slight warping can always show up over time with changes in moisture and temperature. It's something I made sure to discuss with the client before starting the build. Right now I've got 3 separate pieces that will make up the seat, but I can't glue them together yet. I've had to think a lot about the order of assembly to make sure everything fits properly and I don't run into problems later. Now I'm moving on to the sides. I'll build them by stacking 3 boards on top of each other, but I want part of them to be twice as thick so I can cut the inside curve that connects to the backrest. To do that, I can take a thick slab, split it in half, and get 2 pieces out of it. The idea is to make a sofa with no sharp corners at all. Every edge, inside and out, will be curved. And here you can see me wasting time cutting this by hand before realizing the track saw was deep enough to do it. To separate the 2 pieces without damaging either one, I need to cut a wide enough groove for the bandsaw blade to fit through. The quickest and easiest way is to make a few cuts at the same depth and remove the excess. It doesn't need to be perfect. And whenever I get the chance to use this technique, I take it. It's pretty satisfying to break off all those thin wood strips with a chisel. Here you can see what I meant about needing that groove for the bandsaw blade to fit through. I'm sure there's a faster and probably better way to do it, but I had fun doing it this way. That said, I really need to start optimizing my time. I knew this project was going to take a lot of hours, but I think it's starting to get a little out of hand. I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but one thing I'm really bad at as a woodworker is estimating how long a project will take. And I'm not joking, it's actually pretty serious. Getting the time right can be the difference between a project being profitable or not. When you're pricing a piece, if you miscalculate the hours, you might end up basically working for free. That's the risk of taking on commissions. Of course, it's way easier to just build something first and then set a price based on how much work it took. The problem with that is nobody guarantees it'll sell. So even if it's a bit more stressful, it's worth it to build something that's already sold. Now I can join these three pieces together to make the sofa sides and later cut the inside curve. But before I glue them together, I'm going to make things easier for myself later by removing as much material as I can from the area where the curve will go. Right now I can do it easily with the bandsaw, but later I'll have to carve it by hand. So the more wood I take off now, the more time I'll save down the road. I did a bit of research on ergonomics and all that to decide what angle to give the backrest from vertical. Turns out there's a pretty wide range. Some backrests are as upright as 5 degrees, others lean back as much as 20. I talked with the client, and she prefers sitting as straight as possible, with just a slight recline. So I'm going with 7 degrees, which also works really well with the design visually. I need to get 2 thinner boards out of this thick slab, so I'll have to split it in half. It's way too heavy and big for my bandsaw. It already struggled with the pieces for the sides. But no problem, I can do it with this portable chainsaw mill. It's a bit clunky, but it works really well as long as the slab is narrow enough to fit. This model can cut pieces up to 60 centimeters wide, but for that you need a chainsaw with a bar that long. I do want to get one of those someday, but for this slab, it just fits with the one I've got. I don't want this sofa to have a single sharp corner. On the outside edges, that's pretty easy, but the inside corners get a bit more complicated. The pieces that form those joints need to stick out quite a bit, so I can later round them over and create a smooth curve between the perpendicular parts. What really worries me is whether I'll be able to pull it off cleanly once everything is assembled. I've decided the best way to do it is with the angle grinder and carving discs. I don't know how it'll turn out, but I do know it's going to be a ton of work. I've decided to leave the long piece at the back of the base twice as thick as the rest of the boards. I think that'll give the sofa a more stable and solid structure, kind of like a load-bearing wall in a house. It's probably not even necessary since the sofa is already going to be plenty strong, but it makes me feel better. And let's face it, this thing is already going to weigh a ton, so a little extra weight doesn't really matter. The problem is this piece is way too big and heavy for my humble jointer, so I have to flatten it using this other method. It won't end up perfectly smooth like it would through the jointer, but it really doesn't matter, since the 2 wide faces of this piece won't be joined to anything else. I'm using mahogany for this project. This one in particular is a type called kaya, often known as African mahogany. When you hear mahogany, you probably picture one specific type of reddish fancy wood, but in reality there are several different types. The true mahogany comes from Central and South America, things like Honduran mahogany, which has been highly prized for centuries in furniture and boat building. Kaya, on the other hand, comes from Africa. It looks pretty similar with that warm reddish tone and nice grain, but it's a bit lighter and easier to work with. That's why it became such a popular alternative, especially as the traditional sources of mahogany were over-harvested and restricted. One fun bit of trivia: back in the 18th and 19th centuries, mahogany was so desirable that entire wars were fought over access to it. Hard to believe people actually went to war over furniture wood. Makes my workshop feel a little less dramatic. After spending so many days cutting and flattening pieces, I finally get to the fun part, starting to put it all together. Although I've got a feeling that pretty soon it's not going to feel fun at all. The more pieces I join, the heavier this thing gets, and I'm already wondering how I'm going to move it once the weight really adds up. I don't even want to think about what it'll be like when the whole sofa is assembled. That's a problem for future me. He's a nice guy. Takes care of a lot of things I don't feel like dealing with. Unlike that guy, pass me. That lazy guy never lifts a finger and just leaves me with all the work. I added some crossboards on the inside to give the sofa even more stability and strength. Once it's all assembled, it's basically going to be a giant block of wood, pretty much indestructible. For these pieces, it's easier to use regular dowels instead of dominoes. Here I can fix them in their exact position and drill from the inside since the dowels won't be visible anyway. Whenever it's possible, the best way to make a piece fit perfectly is to place it right where it's going to go before making the final cut and mark it there. That way you don't have to measure against the other pieces or distances and risk making a small mistake with the tape measure. I'm going to join the 4 pieces that make up the seat separately and then glue that whole block to the base. I'm doing it this way because it's the easiest way to glue and clamp everything comfortably. Otherwise, I'd have to glue the pieces one by one, clamp them, wait for them to dry, and then add the next one. Before gluing the pieces that will form the inside curves, I'm removing as much material as possible. Right now I can do it fairly easily with the bandsaw, but later I'd have to do it all by hand with the grinder. The 2 side pieces went fine, but the long one doesn't fit on the bandsaw, so I'll have to come up with another way. In a moment, you're going to see me do something I'll definitely regret later. First, I glue the right side piece. Then the left side. So far, so good, right? And now I'm gluing the long piece. Yeah, you probably noticed it. I'm gluing it without cutting off the extra material first. Completely forgot. Looks like someone's going to be really mad at past me again. I don't need dominoes to glue the seat section to the base block. I can do this with dowels too, just to lock it in the right position before gluing. I'll drill the holes in spots that will later be covered by the backrest pieces that go on top. It's not that I don't like using the dominoes. Actually, they've been really helpful and made the work a lot easier. It's just that for this joint, doing it this way is simpler and faster. The dowels here are basically just to keep the pieces in position while the glue sets. They don't really add any extra strength. For this glue up, I'm using a special glue that takes a little longer to dry, which gives me more time to react if something doesn't go quite right. With regular glue, you've got about 15 minutes before it starts to set. This one gives me around 25 to 30 minutes, which takes a lot of the stress out of tricky glue ups. It's not easy to handle pieces this big on my own, so to make things a bit easier, I set it in position and lifted it slightly with a few wooden blocks, just enough to get the glue in. After that, I just pull the blocks out and clamp it down. I'm gluing the pieces in order so I can line them up with the dominoes without any issues and clamp them safely. Sounds simple, but I actually spent quite a bit of time figuring out how to do it without messing it up. Because if there's a wrong way to do it, I'll usually find it. While these joints are drying, I still need to flatten the side pieces. Because of that raised section at the end, I couldn't run them through the jointer or the planer, so I'm using the router sled. I won't be able to reach all the way to the end, but I can get a flat enough surface to use as a reference. The rest I'll finish off with the hand planer. The hand planer is one of those tools I really don't like using, and I try to avoid it unless it's the only option, like in this case. To me, it feels like an imprecise and dangerous tool. Not for me, but for the wood. If you're not really careful, you can take off too much and do some serious damage to the surface of the board. I also need to flatten this part, which is actually the most important one. This surface has to be as flat as possible, since it's the one that's going to be joined to the main backrest board. Yeah, I probably scared myself even more than you. Luckily, the blade didn't catch my finger and it all ended with just a little tachycardia. Lesson learned, don't pull the blade out of the track saw and hold it there with tape while trying to check the angle. Now that I say it out loud, it does sound like a pretty bad idea. Here, I'm confirming something I'd been suspecting since the beginning of the build. The backrest is just too tall, and it doesn't look good at all. Those were the measurements the client asked for, so I decided to build it that way first to really see how it looked and then decide whether to keep it. After talking it over with the client, she completely agreed, so I cut it down to a height that feels a lot more balanced. By the way, shout out to the woman who convinced me to take on this crazy project. Sometimes it's good to have someone who pushes you out of your comfort zone. And besides being really nice, it's always great building something for someone who gives you total freedom and never makes things difficult. First, I'm going to glue together the 3 pieces that make up the backrest, and then I'll attach the whole thing to the rest of the sofa. That way, it's much easier to clamp everything and keep it all in the exact position. Like any good YouTuber, I usually remind viewers in every video that they can subscribe to my channel. But this time, I decided not to. I don't want to be repetitive and predictable. Although, now that I've brought it up, I guess that kind of counts as a reminder anyway. Too late to take it back now. Maybe in my next video, I'll try not to even mention it. I just don't want to be accused of constantly begging people to subscribe to my fun, educational, and entertaining channel. Before gluing everything together, I'm going to cut the curve on the side pieces. Doing it later would be a lot harder. Right now I can do it pretty easily with the bandsaw. I also need to keep the offcuts, because I'll use them later when I glue the backrest to the rest of the seat. They'll give me a flat surface to hold everything in place and tighten the clamps. Yeah, this was a pretty big screw-up. When I shortened the backrest, I didn't think about how the curve's path would change, and the cut went right through the dominoes. That's what happens when you mix being stupid with bad luck. Before gluing everything together, I'm also going to round over the edges. I'll give them a pretty heavy round over with a bit that's 11 millimeters in radius. I'm using the same curve on all the horizontal edges of the sofa. Like most woodworking channels, I get a fair share of comments criticizing the use of wood. People blaming me for deforestation, even calling me a tree killer. And I think it's a topic worth talking about. Personally, I believe wood is one of the best materials we have, with a ton of advantages compared to others. I mean, the people leaving those comments probably have homes full of wooden furniture, doors, or floors. If they really think wood shouldn't be used, what's the alternative? Plastic? Metal? I don't think those are more sustainable or less harmful. Of course, wood production needs to be managed properly and deforestation has to be avoided. But if it's done the right way, I honestly don't think there's a more useful and environmentally friendly material for everyday life than wood. Then again, maybe I'm not the most objective person. If I worked with metal instead of wood, I'd probably be saying the same thing about metal. I don't know. What I do know is, aside from the people calling me a tree killer or saying I make Mother Earth cry, I'm open to hearing other opinions. Before gluing the backrest to the rest of the sofa and ending up with one giant heavy block, I'm flipping the base over so I can round off the bottom edges more easily. I told you I'm using an 11 millimeter radius curve for all the horizontal edges. For the vertical ones, I'm going with a 50 millimeter radius. That part I'll have to do by hand with the angle grinder and some templates. I don't think a router bit that size even exists, and if it does, I'm definitely not the one crazy enough to use it. Since I've already got the sofa flipped over, I'm going to go ahead and install the adjustable feet. They can be leveled individually so the sofa sits properly on the floor. I drilled holes just a bit wider and as deep as the feet are tall so they stay hidden and the sofa sits as close to the floor as possible. All right, I think I'm ready to glue the backrest and finally have the whole sofa together. Hopefully I'm not forgetting anything. To attach the offcuts to the curve and get a flat spot for the clamp, I just glue them on with a bit of cyanoacrylate. That'll hold the pressure from the clamps without coming loose, and later I can pull them off without any problem or damage to the wood. Since the backrest has a slight angle, 7 degrees to be exact, instead of using clamps, I'm going with ratchet straps. They put even pressure straight down, which works better in this case. I hadn't forgotten. I still need to fix the Domino screw-up. Luckily, I've got the offcut from that exact spot, so it won't be hard to find a piece that matches the color and grain. Of course it's going to show. These inlays always do, but I think it'll look pretty decent. Instead of cutting a rectangular patch like you usually see, I rounded the ends. I think that works better since the sofa isn't going to have a single sharp corner anywhere. Well, the moment I've been dreading since I drew the final design is finally here. I have to carve all the curves by hand. That means hours of carving, sanding, sore arms, and breathing in sawdust. The outside curves are relatively easy. They don't take too long. With an aggressive carving disc and one of these Japanese rasps, you can get a pretty decent shape. The inside curves, though, those are going to be the real problem. I'll say this without any doubt. This is the most complicated project I've ever done on my own, and by far, the one that's taken me the most effort. I already had a pretty good idea of that when I accepted the commission, but it turned out even more challenging than I expected. Partly because my workshop isn't as well equipped as I'd like for a project like this. But hey, everything comes with time. Besides how physically exhausting it is to do this for so many hours, I think what really wears you out is having to stay constantly focused and tense. If your hand slips even a little, you can leave a huge mark on a flat surface of the wood, and that's almost impossible to fix. Here's a little tip I just learned the hard way. Never ever use a super aggressive carving disc to file your nails. Go with a regular one instead. It's way less risky. Remember when I said future me was going to be really mad at past me? Well, this is that moment. Thanks to that idiot, I've got a few more hours of carving ahead of me. All right, I'm going to spare you hours of watching me sand. I don't want this video to drag on forever. I was going to tell you how many hours it took me to build this sofa, but I feel like doing a little experiment instead. I'd like to know how many hours people think a project like this actually takes. So if you feel like it, leave a comment with your guess. If someone gets it right, I'll post it in the comments. All that's left now is the finish. Even though the inside won't be visible, you still need to seal it to keep the wood from warping if it only absorbs moisture from one side. I'm going to apply a few coats of hard wax oil. For a sofa, I could go with something tougher, like a polyurethane varnish, but I refuse to cover a piece like this in a layer of plastic. Plus, this kind of finish is much easier to repair. Just a light sanding and another coat. That's it from me. I hope you've enjoyed watching, and maybe this inspires some of you to finally start that project you've had in mind but never got around to.